Turn to Proverbs 5:11. I'm going to cover verses 11 and 12 tonight, hopefully. And the first one's going to be a doozy, so it's going to be some interesting, uncomfortable things probably. Proverbs 5:11, it says, "And thou mourn at the last when thy flesh and thy body are consumed." So we're going to look at that first phrase there, "and thou mourn at the last." Now, if you remember, Solomon gave back in verse 8, he gave his commandment to stay far away from the strange woman. "Remove thy way far from her, and come not nigh the door of her house." And then in verse 9, he gave the first thing that happens to the adulterer, and that is that he immediately loses his honor. "Lest thou give thine honor unto others, and thy years unto the cruel." And then in verse 10, he gives the second thing that will happen after that. That's when his wife takes him to the lawyers, and then after that to the cleaners, and ends up getting at least probably half of his wealth, and then a bunch more in the years to come through alimony, where it says, verse 10, "Lest strangers be filled with thy wealth, and thy labors be in the house of a stranger." Now he gives the last thing that happens after those two things happen, and that is that one's flesh and body are consumed. And this is worse than the shame, or it could be, and the financial penalties that have already been inflicted. And I'm sure there's lots of our countrymen you could ask about how horrible these things are. Lots of people have them, as we'll talk about here in a minute. But he says there, "and thou mourn at the last." Last, when it's used in phrases formed with prepositions like at the last, or at last, or at the last, which is exactly how it's used here, it means at the end, in the end, finally, or ultimately. So this will be the final, third strike and you're out punishment that comes to the adulterer or the fornicator. And the last punishment here is the longest lasting one, both in this life and in probably many cases in the next as well. And it will cause much more mourning because it can last the rest of one's life. It says, "And thou mourn at the last." So it will cause a lot of mourning, which is to feel sorrow, grief, or regret, often with added notion of expressing one's grief, to sorrow, grieve, lament. So this is real serious business here. And this mourning at the last happens when, as he says in the second half of the verse, "when thy flesh and thy body are consumed." So there's at least two ways that one's flesh and body can be consumed, and that is through disease and in hell. And we're going to talk about both of those. We're going to talk more about the first than the latter. So sometimes God accomplishes the consuming of the flesh and body by way of STDs, sexually transmitted diseases, and these inflict infection and suffering on the genitals and other parts of the body. I don't know if you knew this or not, but the penis is called the flesh, or called flesh in Scripture. Look at Ezekiel 23 and verse 20. So this brings a whole other consideration to this verse whenever he says, "Thy flesh and thy body shall be consumed." Ezekiel 23 and verse 20. It says, "And she doted upon their paramours," that's lovers, "whose flesh is as the flesh of asses, and whose issue is like the issue of horses." The Bible is quite graphic. Have you ever seen a donkey whenever it gets excited? That's what this is talking about. Well-endowed lovers here. Their flesh is as the flesh of asses, and issue like the issue of horses. Issue is what issues out. It's like a horse. So this is a graphic description of whoredom that these people were guilty of. Now STDs can consume that flesh, and we'll read about it here in just a minute. So let's consider how the following STDs will consume one's flesh and body. And what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read from an article that I found online from the Mayo Clinic. It's from their website, and the URL is given here, so you can look it up if you want from the outline. So we're going to look at 8 different STDs. And I think this is important. Number one, this is expounding this verse, so it's important to do that. But secondly, This is very important that people know these things, because I think many, many people, though they've heard of STDs, I don't think anybody's ignorant, like they've never heard of them before, but most people, I think, are ignorant of how many of them are out there and how many people are afflicted by them and how easy it is to get one, because probably every fourth person you'll meet out there, especially a young person from stats that I've read before, have one. So this is very, very serious, and this is why I'm going to read these things to you. And you know, they did this to us in the Army. Scared the crap out of us. Sat us down, you probably remember that, sat you down in a classroom and showed you pictures and talked about all these nasty things, because soldiers, I don't even want to know how many percentage of soldiers have these things, but I'm sure tons of them do, because they're all a bunch of fornicating whoremongers, based on my experience anyway. So anyway, let's look at it. Chlamydia is the first one. Chlamydia is a bacterial infection on your genital tract. Chlamydia may be difficult to detect because early stage infections often cause few or no signs or symptoms. When they do occur, symptoms usually start 1 to 3 weeks after you've been exposed to chlamydia and may be mild and pass quickly. And as I was reading through these, I noticed that that's the case with most of these STDs. You don't start getting symptoms until weeks afterwards, or even further along afterwards. And by that time, a lot of times, you're highly contagious, and these fornicators are spreading it all around, and they don't even know they have it. This is the judgment of God, I am convinced. Signs and symptoms may include painful urination, lower abdominal pain, vaginal discharge in women, discharge from the penis in men, pain during sexual intercourse in women, bleeding between periods in women, testicular pain in men. So not something you want to get. Gonorrhea. Gonorrhea is a bacterial infection of your genital tract. The bacteria can also grow in your mouth, throat, eyes, and anus. The first gonorrhea symptoms generally appear within 10 days after exposure. However, some people may be infected for months before signs or symptoms occur. Signs and symptoms of gonorrhea may include thick, cloudy, or bloody discharge from the penis or vagina. Just think about that the next time you want to fornicate with somebody. Pain or burning sensation when urinating. Heavy menstrual bleeding or bleeding between periods. Painful, swollen testicles. Painful bowel movements. Anal itching. Not something you want to get. And then there's I had practiced this before. Trichomoniasis. Trichomoniasis, there we go. Trichomoniasis is a common STI, which stands for sexually transmitted infection. Trichomoniasis is a common STI caused by a microscopic one-celled parasite called Trichomonas vaginalis. This organism spreads during sexual intercourse with someone who already has the infection. The organism usually infects the urinary tract in men, but often causes no symptoms. Trichomoniasis typically infects the vagina in women. When trichomoniasis causes symptoms, they may appear within 5 to 28 days of exposure and range from mild irritation to severe inflammation. Signs and symptoms may include clear, white, greenish, or yellowish vaginal discharge. It's disgusting. Discharge from the penis, strong vaginal odor, vaginal itching or irritation inside the penis, pain during sexual intercourse, painful urination. So horrible, awful, terrible things to get. And then there's HIV and AIDS. Everybody's heard of these, of course. HIV is an infection with the human immunodeficiency virus. HIV interferes with your body's ability to fight off viruses, bacteria, and fungi, I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Anyway, fungi that causes illness and can lead to AIDS, a chronic life-threatening disease. When first infected with HIV, you may have no symptoms. Some people develop a flu-like illness, usually 2 to 6 weeks after being infected. Still, the only way you know if you have HIV is to be tested. Early signs and symptoms. Early HIV signs and symptoms usually disappear within a week to a month and are often mistaken for those of another viral infection. During this period, you're highly infectious. more persistent or more severe symptoms of HIV infection may not appear for 10 years or more after the initial infection. Early stage HIV symptoms may include. And before I read those, just think about that. You can get this, and you may think you have the flu at first, and then you could go on for years and not even know that you have it, and just think you had the flu, and you're infecting people. And the ones that get infected the most are sodomites. This is a disease given directly from the hand of Almighty God, if you ask me, to punish sodomites. And they're the ones, the average sodomite has dozens of partners, or I think maybe even hundreds, I forget. It's some enormous amount of partners throughout his life. And you wonder why they're all dying of HIV and AIDS and everything. So here are the symptoms. Severe fever, headache, sore throat, swollen lymph glands, rash, fatigue. And then it says, as the virus continues to multiply and destroy immune cells, you may develop mild infections or chronic signs and symptoms such as swollen lymph nodes, often one of the first signs of HIV infection, diarrhea, weight loss, fever, cough, and shortness of breath. And then we get into late-stage HIV infection. Signs and symptoms of late-stage HIV infection include persistent, unexplained fatigue, soaking night sweats, shaking, chills, and fever higher than 100.4 Fahrenheit for several weeks, swelling of lymph nodes for more than 3 months, chronic diarrhea, persistent headaches, unusual opportunistic infections. That's a pretty good description of thy flesh and thy body being consumed.
I think that can even be passed on to the woman's child, too, if she's pregnant.
I think so. So. And there's another one, we'll get to it. Syphilis can also be passed on to the child as well.
You know, there's another thing, too, you're talking about the military training. Well, not training, but when I was in there, we went through all that training, like we were talking about the films we watched. And if I remember right, the only thing they brought up then was gonorrhea and syphilis, HIV and AIDS. Never mentioned. I was just wondering if that's something that's happened like in the last 30 or 40 years.
80s, or early 80s
so
is when.
Never mentioned.
Yeah.
So that's come on since then.
Yep.
Most of these have.
You know about
a lot of
HIV and AIDS? Mm-hmm. I would theorize that it was probably around longer than the 80s. Maybe that's when they discovered it. You know what I mean?
It could be. I don't know. I think that's whenever it was when it was discovered anyway. And
maybe before that, people just got sick and died, and they didn't know why.
Yeah.
Especially when we're talking about with that one, can take so many years to happen.
Yeah. To identify it.
Yeah.
But when we were real young like that, there were just a basic 2 or 3 that you even heard about.
Gonorrhea and syphilis. That's all.
It wasn't a list 8 long.
Yep. Yeah, it just seems like the more decadent we get, the more diseases God sends our way.
And with HIV and AIDS, it's usually not the HIV and AIDS that kill people, it's the infections, the secondary infections that kill them.
Yeah, because your immune system's wiped out. And
you get a cold that kills you.
Yep.
You have to take immunosuppressant drugs for life just to keep the disease at bay.
Yeah, it's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Then there's genital herpes. Genital herpes is a highly contagious STI caused by a type of herpes simplex virus, HSV, that enters your body through small breaks in your skin or mucous membranes. Most people with HSV never know they have it because they have no signs or symptoms, or the signs and symptoms are so mild they go unnoticed. When signs and symptoms are noticeable, the first episode is generally the worst. Some people never have a second episode. Others, however, can have recurrent episodes for decades. When present, genital herpes signs and symptoms may include small red bumps, blisters, vesicles, or open sores, ulcers, in the genital and anal areas and areas nearby, pain or itching around the genital area, buttocks, and inner thighs. Ulcers can make urination painful. You may also have pain and tenderness in your genital area until the infection clears. During an initial episode, you may have flu-like signs and symptoms such as a headache, muscle aches, and fever, as well as swollen lymph nodes in your groin. In some cases, the infection can be active and contagious even when sores aren't present. And then there's one called the human papillomavirus, HPV, and genital warts. So apparently these are similar things. HPV infection is one of the most common types of STIs. Some forms of HPV put women at high risk of cervical cancer. That's why these sickos are trying to, allegedly anyway, trying to inoculate young girls as young as like 9 or something with the HPV vaccine, and young boys for that matter too, for some stupid thing like somehow they could pass it on to girls or something. But anyway, yeah, these prepubescent kids, they're wanting to inoculate with this because they apparently suspect that they'll turn into fornicators and then have a risk of cancer. But anyway, yeah, that Rick, what's his name down in Texas, the old governor of Texas, he was forcing all school children to get this HPV immunization. Anyway.
You see that ad on TV all the time.
Oh, yeah. Oh, Gardasil, I think it's called. I think it's what the vaccine's called. Other forms cause genital warts. HPV usually has no signs or symptoms. The signs and symptoms of genital warts include small flesh-colored or gray swellings in your genital area, several warts close together that take on a cauliflower shape. That would look real nice. Itching or discomfort in your genital area, bleeding with intercourse. Often, however, genital warts cause no symptoms. Genital warts may be as small as 1 millimeter in diameter and may multiply into large clusters, Warts can also develop in the mouth or throat of a person who has had oral sex with an infected person. And next there is hepatitis. Hepatitis A, hepatitis B, and hepatitis C are all contagious viral infections that affect your liver. I didn't realize that all 3 of those hepatitises are sexually transmitted, but apparently they are, according to the Mayo Clinic here.
Are they always sexually transmitted?
No, you can get at least some of them other ways.
A is fecal oral route, and some of them can just be exposure to blood.
Yeah. Hepatitis B and C are the most serious of the 3, but each can cause your liver to become inflamed. Some people never develop signs or symptoms, but for those who do, signs and symptoms may occur several weeks after exposure and may include fatigue, nausea, and vomiting, abdominal pain or discomfort, especially in the area of your liver on your right side underneath your lower ribs, loss of appetite, fever, dark urine, muscle or joint pain, itching, yellowing of your skin, and the whites of your eyes, jaundice.
So all healthcare workers are required to get the hepatitis B vaccine because we come in exposure to blood.
To blood, yeah.
And that's the way you get that one.
Yeah. And lastly, we have syphilis. Syphilis is old. I think I remember my grandparents talking about people they knew that had syphilis way back. Some of these, I think the syphilis and the bacterial ones, if they catch them early enough, they can kill them with antibiotics, I'm pretty sure. But if syphilis is left, it can make you go nuts, affect your brain and all kinds of stuff. Syphilis is a bacterial infection. Oh, and by the way, here's another one when I'm thinking about syphilis. You ever heard of the Tuskegee experiments down in Tuskegee, I think it was Alabama, where our government took and intentionally infected a bunch of black people with syphilis just let them have it without treating them, just to see what would happen to them, the long-term effects of syphilis, the Tuskegee experiments. Yeah. And that is not some theory, that is publicly available facts. It's horrible. Anyway, syphilis is a bacterial infection. The disease affects your genitals, skin, and mucous membranes, but it can also involve many other parts of your body, including your brain and your heart. The signs and symptoms of syphilis may occur in 3 stages: primary, secondary, and tertiary. Some people also experience latent syphilis, in which blood tests are positive for the bacteria but no symptoms are present. At first, only a small painless sore, a canker, may be present at the site of infection, usually the genitals, rectum, tongue, or lips. As the disease worsens, symptoms may include rash marked by red or reddish-brown, penny-sized sores over any area of your body, including your palms and soles. That would be real nice. It'd be painful even to walk. Fever, enlarged lymph nodes, fatigue, and a vague feeling of discomfort, soreness, and aching. Without treatment, syphilis bacteria may spread, leading to serious internal organ damage and death years after the original infection. Some of the signs and symptoms of late-stage syphilis include lack of coordination, numbness, paralysis, blindness, dementia. There's also a condition known as congenital syphilis, which occurs when a pregnant woman with syphilis passes the disease to her unborn infant. Congenital syphilis can be disabling, even life-threatening, so it's important for pregnant women with syphilis to be treated. Now, STDs are ubiquitous in America today. It means they're all over the place. At any given time, there are 110 million STIs, sexually transmitted infections, among Americans. I'm going to quote here from a few different sources to show this to you. This is from an article in 2013 on MedicineNet. It was called Millions of Americans Have an STD Report. It says experts estimate that the number of sexually transmitted infections among Americans now totals more than 110 million. Now there's 330 million people in the country, so that's a third of the population. Now, many of these people have more than one, so it's not actually 110 million people that have an STD. It's that there's 110 million infections, and I will read that to you here in just a second. This one's from the New York Times, an article in 2017. It's called, In the U.S., 110 million STD infections. It says the incidence of chlamydia, gonorrhea, and syphilis is increasing, according to a new report from the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. At any given time, there are an estimated 110 million sexually transmitted infections in the United States. Now, this article added the following correction after publishing the article. Quote, an earlier version of this story misstated the prevalence of sexually transmitted diseases in the United States. There are 110 million such infections, not 110 million people with infections at any given time. Some people have more than one infection. And here is an article from The Atlantic in 2018, a couple of years ago. It was called, Why Are STDs on the Rise if Americans Are Having Less Sex? It says on Tuesday, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention announced that reported cases of 3 sexually transmitted diseases in the United States had reached an all-time high in 2017. Rates of gonorrhea rose by 67%, syphilis by 76%, and chlamydia by 21%, to a total of almost 2.3 million cases nationwide. According to the CDC, 2017 surpassed 2016 as the year with the most reported STD cases on record and marked the 4th year in a row that STDs increased steeply in the U.S. And yet, nobody repents. Nobody changes. These things are just going off the charts. 67% increase year over year of gonorrhea? It's insane. It's incredible. And millions of people are getting these things. They're not changing their ways.
And just for their knowledge, gonorrhea and chlamydia can also be found in the throats of people. So, I mean, you might not have it anywhere else, but you can have it there.
Yeah. Yep. And transmit it from there, too. Yep.
And teenagers think oral sex is not sex.
Yeah, right. And most of these things can be transmitted that way. And you know where they got that idea? From old
Clinton.
Slick Willie. Yeah, from Bill Clinton. Yep. It's a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God. Hebrews 10:31. You read the description of those diseases, and I totally believe that God sent those on this earth to punish people and you realize how dreadful and fearful God is. Hebrews 10 and verse 31 says, "It is a fearful thing to fall into the hands of the living God." So what's the solution to the STD problem in America? Quit fornicating. The STD problem could be over in a generation. Just quit fornicating. Wait till you have sex to get married and stay married and only have one partner for your entire life, and there'd be no STDs within a generation or two. They'd be gone. Totally. Or just about. I mean, then maybe they could transmit other ways, but by and large, they'd be gone. That's all they'd have to do.
It wouldn't be increasing by 67% a year.
No, absolutely not. So, my word is to anybody that hears this sermon, quit fornicating before your flesh and body are consumed. And parents must warn their children of these dreadful diseases, which they will very likely contract if they fornicate. And this is really important. Obviously, Braden's way too young now, but whenever he gets older, teach him these things. Every parent with children should be talking about these things to their kids. Now, if you remember, I said that there were two ways that one's flesh and body could be consumed from fornicating. The second way is that the fornicator's flesh and body could be consumed in the lake of fire after the final judgment. Hebrews 12 and verse 29. And this might be right after he ends up dying of AIDS or syphilis or some horrible disease, only to be cast into the lake of fire. Hebrews 12 and verse 29 says, "For our God is a consuming fire." That's why we ought to serve him acceptably with reverence and godly fear, as the previous verse says. God judges whoremongers and adulterers. This God that's a consuming fire is a God of judgment. Hebrews 13:4, "Marriage is honorable in all, and the bed undefiled, but whoremongers and adulterers God will judge." He'll judge them with STDs. He'll judge them with hellfire. Go ahead and turn to Matthew 10 and verse 28. Matthew 10 and verse 28. Jesus said, "And fear not them which kill the body, but are not able to kill the soul, but rather fear him which is able to destroy or consume both soul and body in hell." And just to show you that one of the types of people that hell's reserved for are fornicators, turn to Revelation 21